Justice is a powerful thing. It's the foundation of a fair and equitable society, ensuring that those who do wrong are held accountable for their actions. But what happens when those actions are heinous that justice demands more than the usual punishment? In today's video, we're delving into the realm of extraordinary, exploring the stories of criminals who have been handed down some of the longest sentences in history. Moses Sithole, 2,410 years in prison. Moses Sithole, a name that sends shivers down the spines of many South Africans, is the country's most notorious serial killer. Between 1994 and 1995, he terrorized the communities of Atteridgeville, Boksburg, and Cleveland, leaving a trail of death and destruction in his wake. Born in 1964 in Atteridgeville, South Africa, Moses Sithole had a troubled childhood. He left school at an early age and fell into a life of petty crime. In July 1994, Sithole's reign of terror began. He targeted women and children, luring them to secluded spots and brutally assaulting and murdering them. His crimes were marked by extreme savagery, leaving the community in a state of fear and panic. Sithole's modus operandi was always the same. He would approach his victims often under the pretense of asking for directions or help. Once he had gained their trust, he would lead them to an isolated area and attack them. He would then rape and strangle his victims, often leaving them with their hands tied behind their backs. Sithole's crimes earned him the infamous moniker the ABC Murders because they began in Atteridgeville, continued in Boksburg, and ended in Cleveland. As the body count grew, the police were under immense pressure to catch the killer. In July 1994, Sithole began a series of brutal murders. He would target women who were walking alone at night, and he would strangle them and then rape them. He also killed a 3-year-old girl. Sithole's crimes caused widespread fear and panic in the Johannesburg area. The police were baffled by the murders, and they were unable to find any leads. In October 1995, Sithole was arrested after a woman reported that he had tried to rape her. The police were able to link him to the ABC murders through DNA evidence. He was initially charged with 29 murders, but the number of victims would eventually rise to at least 38. During police interrogation, Sithole confessed to his crimes, describing them in chilling detail. He claimed that he derived a twisted sense of pleasure from watching his victims' eyes bulge out as they died. Sithole's trial began in November 1996. He pleaded not guilty, claiming that his confession had been coerced. However, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against him and he was found guilty on all counts. In December 1997, Sithole was sentenced to an effective 2,410 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 930 years. This is the longest prison sentence ever handed down in South Africa. Marwan Barghouti, 5,200 years in prison. Marwan Hassieb Ibrahim Barghou is a Palestinian political figure convicted and imprisoned for slaying by an Israeli court. He was regarded as the leader of the First and Second Intifadas. Barghouti was a leader of Tanzim, a paramilitary offshoot of Fatah. Israeli authorities have labeled Barghouti as a terrorist, accusing him of coordinating numerous attacks against civilians and military targets alike. Barghouti was arrested by Israeli Defense Forces in 2002 in Ramallah. The Israeli Authority arrested Barghouti and accused him of involvement in 5 separate attacks that resulted in deaths of Israelis. These charges included planning and ordering attacks, complicity in killings, and membership in a terrorist organization. Barghouti's trial, held in an Israeli military court, was marred by allegations of unfairness and a lack of due process. In 2004, Barghouti was convicted on 5 counts of murder and was sentenced to 5 life sentences, each representing separate killings. Additionally, he was sentenced to an additional 40 years for attempted murder and membership in a terrorist organization. Overall, he was sentenced to 5,200 years in prison. Terry Nichols, 161 life sentences plus 9,300 years without parole. The Oklahoma City bombing occurred on April 19, 1995, when a truck bomb was detonated outside the Alfred Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. 168 people were killed in the blast, while over 680 civilians were injured. The attack targeted the Murrah Building, which housed several federal agencies, including the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The bombing was planned and carried out by Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, who were motivated by their anger and resentment towards the federal government, particularly the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms. McVeigh was arrested few hours after the bombing and was later convicted and sentenced to death for his role in the attacks. Then Nichols was arrested few days later and was convicted of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter for the death of federal law enforcement personnel. In 1997, Nichols was given 161 life sentences by Oklahoma State Court on 161 counts of first-degree murder and 9,300 years of imprisonment without the possibility of parole for aiding McVeigh in conducting the attacks. Dudley Wayne Kaiser, 2 life terms plus 10,000 years. In Tuscaloosa, Alabama, during a Halloween night, Dudley Wayne Kaiser committed a triple murder. The victims were his wife, his mother-in-law, and a college student. His neighbor recalled that after hearing what she believed were firecrackers, she saw Emily laying in another neighbor's driveway with a wounded chest. Her son ran away after witnessing his mother's shooting, but it got worse. When police arrived, they found Emily's mother and Richard Peyron dead. They had both been shot in the head. In 1977, he was sentenced to death by electric chair, but the conviction was overturned. When he was retried in 1981, he received 2 life sentences plus 10,000 years in prison. Alan Wayne McLaurin, 20,750 years in prison. In 1996, Alan Wayne McLaurin was sentenced to 12 years in prison for his participation in several horrendous crimes, such as kidnapping, rape, and robbery. His partner in crime was Darren Anderson. Together, the 2 men had committed some of the worst acts imaginable, with the most notable one being the night they spotted an elderly woman at a gas station in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They followed her after she left, then rammed her vehicle off the highway. After that, the 2 men raped her repeatedly for several hours. Somehow, Anderson felt like he had been given an unfair sentence, so he requested a reconsideration. After one of their case was reviewed, the judge ended up sentencing Darren to 11,500 years, while McLaurin was sentenced to 20,750 years in prison. Charles Scott Robinson, 30,000 years in prison. Charles Scott Robinson was born into an ordinary family in Oklahoma City. He grew up in a quiet neighborhood and seemed to live a relatively normal life. In the early 1990s, Robinson's life took a sinister turn. He began preying on the most vulnerable members of the society, children. His crimes were unspeakable acts of unimaginable cruelty that left a trail of devastation in their wake. Robinson's reign of terror came to an end in 1994 when he was arrested for the rape of a 3-year-old girl. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was found guilty of 6 counts of child sexual abuse. The judge in the case, Dean Owen, was faced with a difficult decision. How would he ensure that Robinson will never harm another child again? In a move that stunned the legal community, Owen sentenced Robinson to an extraordinary 30,000 years in prison. Emilio Suarez Trashora, 34,715 years in prison. On the fateful morning of March 11, 2004, the tranquil city of Madrid was jolted awake by a series of devastating explosions. 10 bombs, meticulously concealed within backpacks, detonated on 4 commuter trains during the morning rush hour. The blast sent shockwaves across the city, leaving behind a trail of destruction and despair. The impact of the attack was cataclysmic. 191 innocent lives were tragically extinguished and over 1,800 were wounded. One of the men responsible for this event was Emilio Suarez Trashara. He was a Spanish miner who was arrested in 2001 for trafficking explosives. He was released from prison in 2003, but he was arrested again in 2004 after the Madrid train bombing. Trashora was charged with providing explosives for the terrorists who carried out the bombings. He was sentenced to 34,715 years in prison. Jamal Zougam, 42,922 years in prison. Jamal Zougam, a Moroccan migrant, was another person who was involved in planning and executing the 2004 Madrid bombing. According to investigators, Zougam provided logistical support to the bombers, including acquiring SIM card and renting apartments. He was also seen leaving a rucksack on one of the bombed trains. Zogam's trial began on October 2006 and lasted several months. In October 2006, Zugam was found guilty of providing support to a terrorist organization and sentenced to 42,922 years in prison. Othman el-Nawi, 42,924 years in prison. Othman el-Janoui is another migrant from Morocco who played a crucial role in the 2004 Madrid bombing. In 2003, el-Janoui became deeply involved in planning of the 2004 Madrid train bombings. He played a key role in acquiring and assembling the explosives used in the attacks, working closely with other members of a terrorist cell. El-Janoui was arrested in April 2004 and was charged with multiple counts of terrorism-related offenses. In October 2007, he was found guilty and was sentenced to 42,924 years in prison. Chamoy Thipiasso, 141,078 years in prison. Chamoy Thipiasso is a former employee of Thailand Petroleum Authority. She is infamous for receiving the world's longest prison sentence of 141,078 years for her role in a pyramid scheme that defrauded over 16,000 Thais and was estimated to have been worth between $200 million and $301 million. She established the My Chamoy Fund, a chit fund disguised to look like an oil share with high returns in the late 1960s. Thanks to her connections with the Air Force and Petroleum Authority, the fund survived for a remarkable long time. The scheme appeared legitimate thanks to military backing. The scheme continued until the mid-1980s. There were calls for the government to bail out the banks and the chit fund because the fund had many politically influential investors from the military and even the royal household. The Chamoy Fund was closed after private conversations with King Bhumibol Adulyadej, during which Chamoy Thipiasso was detained. Her trial wasn't carried out until after all the losses of the involved military and royal personnel had been recovered. On July 22, 1989, a jury found Thipiasso and 7 other defendants guilty of corporate fraud. She was sentenced to 141,078 years in prison. However, she completed just about 8 years of her sentence before she was released. If you enjoyed this video and you found it entertaining, please subscribe and ring the notification bell to get notified whenever we post a new video like this. Also, leave a comment. See you next time. Thanks for watching. Ciao!